Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday the 2nd of April in London. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Israel strikes Iran's embassy compound in Syria as regional tensions in the Middle East escalate. Markets cool on the prospect of a June rate cut by the Federal Reserve as the US economy refuses to slow down. Plus, we'll tell you why Donald Trump's net worth dropped by $1 billion in just one day. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Iran says Israel has killed a top military commander and several others in an attack on its embassy compound in Syria. Iranian and Syrian state media reported the airstrike in Damascus in what would mark a significant escalation of tensions between the longtime adversaries. Iran's ambassador to Syria, Hossein Akbari, vowed a decisive response.
The Zionist regime definitely knows better than anyone that such crimes and violating international law will have its response in an appropriate time.
That's Iran's ambassador to Syria there. The Israeli military, meanwhile, has said it wouldn't comment on foreign media reports. The news of the strike comes after Israel agreed to in-person talks with the United States over its controversial plans to invade the city of Rafah in southern Gaza. Bond traders are scaling back expectations for interest rate cuts after a measure of US factory activity showed expansion for the first time since 2022. The ISM manufacturing report for March exceeded all estimates in Bloomberg's survey of economists. According to former New York Fed president and Bloomberg opinion columnist Bill Dudley, monetary policy isn't restrictive enough to spur rate cuts.
Right now, there's a bit of a battle going on, the long legs of monetary policy versus the easing of financial conditions. And my personal opinion is monetary policy is not really exerting that much restraint on the economy. And that's why the Fed has been on this path of having to stay higher for longer.
Bloomberg opinion columnist and former New York Fed President Bill Dudley speaking there. Traders are currently pricing in around 70 basis points of cuts for this year versus more than 150 basis points at the start of the year. Bloomberg Economics has run 1 million simulations to test the fragility of the US debt outlook. Nearly 90% of them reach the same conclusion: borrowing is on an unsustainable path. The forecast model, which uses market pricing for future interest rates and data on the maturity profile of bonds, shows debt equaling 123% of GDP by 2034. The analysis comes as Citadel founder Ken Griffin issued a similar warning to his investors, calling the US national debt a growing concern. Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet has the details.
He cites U.S. national debt as, quote, a growing concern that cannot be overlooked. In the letter, a copy of which was obtained by Bloomberg, Griffin said net interest spending is estimated to reach 3.1% of gross domestic product for 2023, citing Congressional Budget Office estimates. He says that is a percentage point more than the average from 1974 to 2023. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Inflation in UK shops has slowed to its lowest level in more than 2 years. The British Retail Consortium says the pace of price rises slowed to 1.3% last month, the lowest since December 2021. Food price inflation also eased for a 10th month in a row to 3.7% as supermarkets continue to compete for customers. The survey offers encouraging signs that headline inflation is slowing, raising hopes for interest rate cuts from the Bank of England. Donald Trump's net worth fell by $1 billion as shares of his social media business tumbled. Trump Media and Technology Group stock fell by 21% after it disclosed a $58 million loss for last year. That's erased any gains that it's made since its SPAC merger last week, though the company is still worth $6.6 billion. The former president's legal woes also continue, as Bloomberg's Ed Baxter now reports.
The payment of the $175 million bond puts his massive civil fraud verdict of $454 million on hold while he appeals, and it assures that Attorney General Letitia James cannot begin seizing Trump assets. In another trial, the hush money, the judge has broadened the gag order after he says Trump attacked him and his daughter on social media. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
And the US House Speaker Mike Johnson is calling for new aid for Ukraine to be approved right away. The Republican leader is still working to soften opposition to the plans, leaving doubts about whether assistance will reach Kyiv in time to make a difference. Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, says US support will be pivotal in deciding the war's outcome.
There are a lot of factors that indicate that Ukraine is not only winning, but will come out victorious in the end, provided we give them this assistance. The frozen assets are $330 billion. If Ukraine can get that, it will for sure outlast Russia in this war and likely prevail. And also it'll provide a nice glide path for them into European Union membership.
Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute speaking there. The Senate has already passed its own Ukraine aid plan in February. A new version from the House could cause further delays to the funding. Another story that caught our eye this morning about so-called golden passport schemes from Caribbean countries getting much more expensive. This as the US and European Union puts pressure on states to crack down on such sales. So a group of 4 Caribbean countries, including Grenada and St. Kitts and Nevis, have agreed to charge at least $200,000 for their passports starting on the 30th of June. That's double the current rate in some cases. The countries are also going to close loopholes that allowed passports to be sold at a discount. Now, these golden passports, as they're known, give visa-free access to the EU, the UK and other countries, which make them popular with nationalities that would normally be required to apply for travel permits. Demand for these passports is soaring, according to Apex Capital Partners, which is a firm that advises individuals on second citizenship. They say that interest is up 300% during the first 2 months of this year. These citizenship by investment programs are also big money makers for these countries. They rake in around $580 million a year in the Caribbean. In some cases can make up more than half of the national revenue of some of these tiny island nations. St. Lucia, though, where passports sell for $100,000, didn't sign this agreement, which could undermine the New Deal. But another story that of interest to us this morning. Let's turn, though, now to those reports from Iranian and Syrian media of an Israeli airstrike on Iran's embassy compound in Syria. It's the latest episode in the long-running shadow war between Israel and Iran. Our Middle East breaking news editor, Dana Craich, joins us now for more. Dana, great to have you with us. What can you tell us about what we know about this airstrike?
Good morning. Iran and state-run Syrian media, as well as activists on the ground there, say Israeli strikes struck a compound linked to Iran's embassy in Damascus, killing 2 generals and 5 others. So images out of Syria show a building completely destroyed, demolished as a result. This is quite a major strike and comes a few days after another suspected Israeli strike in Syria killed 6 Hezbollah members, but that was in Aleppo, not in the heart of Damascus. Israel rarely comments on these strikes, but has repeatedly said it would prevent first weapons transfers to Iran-linked militias via Syria, and that it is part of its ongoing war and would attack anything that would threaten its existence, pretty much.
Yep. Israel has been striking targets linked to Iran in Syria for years. These strikes have stepped up, though, since the war in Gaza began last October. How much of an escalation is this to target more directly Iran by targeting this compound linked to the embassy?
Israel has upped the ante with these strikes, especially this year, actually more so than since October 7. And activists say that at least 30 suspected Israeli strikes have hit Iran-linked asset. This one is an escalation because, like you said, it hit an Iran embassy compound. This is a direct hit and not just some base somewhere in Syria. A direct attack on a more official representation for Iran. It's also at the same time embarrassing for Iran and its allies, who have reduced their attacks from Syria and Iraq on U.S. assets there. And now it has to save face somehow and respond to these attacks, as many of the officials have been saying.
What sort of response might we expect from Iran in this case?
So earlier this year, Iran struck Erbil and said it attacked a spy base and claimed it was linked to the Mossad. It could perhaps do the same and hit somewhere that doesn't really hit a nerve, but it shows that it can retaliate. We could see the Houthis stepping up attacks in the Red Sea, or we could see militias in Iraq and Syria regaining that momentum and start attacking perhaps U.S. bases. We did see a report that's still unverified by us that the U.S. shot down an attack drone targeting an outpost in Syria today.
At the same time, of course, the background to this, Dana, is the continuing war in Gaza. What we've been hearing there is that the US and Israel have agreed to an in-person meeting to discuss an expected Israeli invasion of Rafah, the city in the south of Gaza. Is that a sign of improving ties between the US and Israel?
I'd say it's a sign that both countries want to cool tensions that have really hit a peak last week, with the U.S. abstaining from a Security Council resolution that demanded a ceasefire. Israel now is growing more under pressure and more isolated in the region and kind of the world, and needs its most important ally. And the U.S. at the same time also needs Israel to listen, to show that it can rein in Prime Minister Netanyahu and appease its own allies in the West and Arab countries as well, who have also grown frustrated with Israel not listening and just doing things as it wants.
Okay, Dana Crater, our Middle East Breaking News editor, thank you very much for bringing us up to date with those stories from the region. Let's turn next to the major market story today. That stronger than expected US factory data reinforcing speculation the Federal Reserve won't rush to cut interest rates. The ISM manufacturing index showing expansion for the first time since 2022. Bloomberg TV anchor Kriti Gupta is with us for more on this. Morning to you, Kriti. Let's talk through this data first. How much does the ISM reading feed into the other pieces of data that we've had and the kind of overall narrative around the US economy?
So the ISM numbers don't usually get that much attention unless they confirm a trend that you've seen in CPI numbers and PPI numbers and PCE deflators and all sorts of other fun economic data. And that's where the ISM data actually matters in particular. And when you look at the ISM specifically, we tend to look at it more for its manufacturing numbers than its services numbers, simply because manufacturing in the United States has been the kind of the laggard in some ways. That's where you've seen the deceleration. It's more kind of capex insensitive, industry sensitive, obviously. But it doesn't necessarily matter for the broader economic picture, simply because some of that is a function of supply chain issues or union issues, for example, whereas services make up 70, 80% of the American economy. So you really want to keep an eye on the services data. When the ISM comes in hot, though, that's when it becomes a problem, especially because it's in such stark contrast to the downtrend that you've seen in that particular data set. And that's when you start to see, okay, well, hold on a second. Maybe those qualms around reacceleration of inflation start to kind of come to the forefront. And that's why you saw such a massive reaction in Treasuries yesterday. Of course, Europe was off, but when you look at the United States and even in Asia, this big 10, 14 basis point move intraday, it's that sensitivity that you're seeing.
So put that sort of scale of that move in context first, because we were talking at one stage about traders pulling back on their bets on a cut in June to less than 50%. So that's sort of rebalanced a little bit since. Kind of in the scale of how much recent data points have moved markets, where does this come in?
It comes in as pretty strong, actually. So this was a pretty knee-jerk reaction, because remember, if you look at the Fed swaps pricing, and you mentioned the June pricing in particular, you've had it go from at the beginning of the year, which was just 3 short months ago, 7 to 6 or 6 to 7 rate cuts, now pricing in somewhere between 3 to 2. I think you're now at about 2 rate cuts at the moment. And even that timeline's getting pushed back further and further, because the initial one was priced in for June. Now I think the first one is being priced in for July, the last time I checked. This is significant as well on the nominal side, because one of the concerns here was that you see all this kind of repricing in the Fed swaps market, kind of in that nitty gritty piece, but you're not seeing it on the surface, which is why you kind of see this kind of range bound 420 to 430 move within the 10-year yield, for example. The problem here is that the surface kind of volatility has been not volatile at all, so very lack of volatility, not moving, whereas the kind of underlying mechanics and the contracts have been more volatile. And that disconnect has been an issue to some who've said, well, maybe the bond market is too sanguine right now. Maybe it's not, or maybe it's pricing in the wrong thing, or maybe it's pricing in too much of inflation or too many rate cuts. And some would argue it both ways. The concern here is for the people who are very excited about bond volatility would say, well, actually, now this is the bond volatility waking up to the economic data, and you're seeing it come up on the surface as opposed to just on the underlying. The other side of this equation is that this is a pretty big move. You don't want 10 to 14 basis point moves, because that's what happened last fall in the long end of the curve. And if you see sustained volatility like that for, say, a month, 2 months, that's what catches the eye of not just central bankers in the States, but central bankers around the world, saying this adds to some of the Treasury and gilts pain and Boons pain and JGB pain that you see around the world.
And of course, another factor involved in all of this too is the question of supply in the markets linked to the debt outlook in the US as well. And Bloomberg Economics has been looking at this, running 1 million forecast simulations on the US debt outlook, and pointing the vast majority of almost 90% borrowing being an unsustainable path. How big a problem is US government debt?
Oh, it's a big problem, but it's one of the it's enormous, but it's one of those things that's kind of like viewed at the moment, rightly or wrongly, as kind of in that government shutdown era train of thought. So which is basically that this will solve itself out. This is a long-term problem. It's not going to affect us at the moment. So you hear these warnings from the
Call
congressional...
me when there's a crisis.
Right. You hear from the Congressional Budget Office, for example, making this really big claim that I think by 2034 that you're going to start to see 119% debt to GDP, for example. For context, those are along the numbers that you saw in Portugal or Italy back in the European debt crisis. Now imagine the world's largest economy having those same GDP numbers. Bloomberg Economics saying, well, hold on a second, it gets a whole lot worse, to your point. And again, this is something that's going to have longer term implications. But for the short term, it's that longer 30-year kind of maturity that you want to look at in the long term, because remember, these were the concerns that showed up last fall that created issues in terms of liquidity in the long end, that created issues for the BOJ, for example. Governor Ueda famously saying that they're watching what's going on in the 30-year mortgage market in the United States, which is weird for Japan, but it's a problem, just not yet.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.